This is another AND Campaign Civic update, and today I want to talk about the Republican primary debate that took place last night at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Once again, the big story being that Trump did not show up. Based on the spirit of the democratic process, I think that's wrong. He should have to answer to the people. He should be tested by the other candidates, but I understand it strategically. This time it was there were, instead of having 8 people on stage like the first time, they actually had 7, which to me is just still too many. It proved to be very chaotic, with everybody desperately trying to get a word in and speaking over each other, and it just wasn't representative of what I think a presidential debate should be. Until you get down to about 4, this is going to be the case, and we're not going to get a whole lot out of it. But I understand that they want to give everybody a chance. It just doesn't work very well. The first issue that came up was the auto worker strike against the 3 major automakers. And while Americans seem to be overwhelmingly in support of the auto workers, it didn't seem like the folks on stage, the majority of them were in support of the workers. Some said that they were asking for too much. Others said that they agreed, that they had compassion for them. But this was really an issue of the government putting its hands into the auto market, and that's what the problem was. So that was interesting. Then one of the other questions was about immigration. The moderator pointed out that Ronald Reagan himself had given amnesty to immigrants at some point, and many of them really took that time to talk about Biden's policies and how it has created a crisis on our border, and that we need to have security on the border. I think that was, they came together and had some agreement there. Tim Scott and Nikki Haley came out firing. They were really aggressive, I think to a fault. They ended up talking over people and really coming off as desperate. So 2 of the people that I think didn't do very well was Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, because they were just so aggressive, and I don't think it came off well. The person who I think benefited from that was Ron DeSantis, based on his posture. Now, I always say that I am not the base of the Republican Party. I'm not the intended audience for what they're trying to do. But I thought that because he came off as more composed, he came off as more presidential, he answered his questions quickly, he didn't talk over anybody. Whether or not I agree with what he was saying is beside the point. I think he came off well and handled the questions well, considering what he was given. 2 low points of the debate for me were, number one, when Tim Scott compared slavery to the Great Society. The Great Society is basically the policies of Lyndon Johnson that created a lot of our welfare programs. While the Great Society wasn't perfect, he basically said, we survived slavery, but we barely survived the Great Society because single-parent households, there were more single-parent households in the 1970s, which is correlated with the Great Society, than there were before that. But I think that's a very flawed and misleading way to look at it. First and foremost, when it comes to families, in slavery, the black family wasn't really even a legally recognized entity. We're talking about forced separations. We're talking about rapes. We're talking about castrations and all these other things that made the black family almost non-existent. So to say that there were some policies that may not have, that in correlation may have added to the breakdown of black family, and to compare that to slavery, is completely ridiculous. And I think Tim Scott should rethink that whole conversation, because the black family was completely destroyed during slavery. Don't compare that to the Great Society. It's almost as if the Great Society gave people food to eat and created some roads, and that destroyed the black family. And that's just not the case. Folks don't want to talk about mass incarceration. Folks don't want to talk about drugs flooding black communities. We just want to blame it on policies that were progressive and we don't like. I think that's unfortunate. The second part that I thought wasn't all that great either was Mike Pence. When asked about criminal justice, he basically said what we need to do for these mass shooters is we need to have more death penalties, and we need to have them quicker. Instead of them being in jail for a couple years, let's just have these death penalties within months. Given the fact that sometimes, first of all, we have a process for that, and we always have to go through due process. And I don't know why anybody, especially Christian, would be cheering for the death penalty. I thought that was a bad answer, especially in light of all the things when it comes to criminal justice that we're dealing with that seemed like an answer that wanted to get to some of the extreme folks who just want to see hard, kind of like a hard-nosed law and order, and could care less about the nuances and the process that we have to go through to get there. So I thought those were two downsides. Hey, if you like this conversation, want to hear more about it, you need to tune into the Church Politics Podcast with myself and the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. That's every week. You can get it on iTunes, you can get it on Spotify, you can get it on YouTube. Check us out.